Pay close attention to this picture you are about to see, because it is real. In 1998, during the first Space Shuttle mission to the International Space Station, NASA mistakenly took this picture of a strange black object orbiting the Earth. They didn't know what it was. Heck, the rest of the world didn't know what it was, and for a long time, it remained like that. In such, there are still talks of the object still being in space, moving smoothly along Earth's orbit. The only thing we know of this object is its name, the Black Knight satellite, and even the origin of how the name came to be is a mystery, making this object one of the most mysterious things humanity has ever witnessed. The information we have about the Black Knight comes from a bunch of different stories and theories, but we can pinpoint an origin story that begins with the main man himself, Nikola Tesla. Tesla was at the time performing some radio experiments in one of his labs at Colorado Springs in 1899. During one of the experiments, Tesla noticed something odd. He noticed that he was receiving radio signals from one place that should be impossible: space. Tesla was surprised. This was in 1899, so you can rule out any form of satellite, which left one option, even though it sounded crazy. I'm pretty sure the quote from Arthur Conan Doyle was ringing in his ear. Once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. To Tesla, he just made contact with aliens. He wrote about his experiences in an article for Collier's Weekly in February 1901. The changes I noted were taking place periodically, and with such a clear suggestion of number and order that they were not traceable to any cause then known to me. The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greeting of one planet to another. He believed with all his being that he was the first to establish some sort of contact with beings from other planets. Some of us believe this was the first time the Black Knight made contact with humans by sending radio waves, like the plot of the movie Three-Body Problem. This idea spread even more when, in 1927, civil engineer and ham radio user Jürgen Haas noticed something strange about his radio signals. As he transmitted from his home in Oslo, the signals would suddenly come back to him, just moments later, like an echo. Hals also thought this was something weird, and possibly from another world, corroborating Tesla's claims. Then, in 2013, almost 50 years after Hal's death, a story in Analog Science Fiction and Fact tried to figure out what the radio waves meant. And that's when this man entered the chat room. This is Duncan Lunan, and according to him, he suggested that the long-delayed echoes might have been caused by an object orbiting the moon, with an origin point of 13,000 years ago. The 13,000 figure has to do with the positioning of the North Pole star Polaris. I tried plotting the delay times against the order in which the echoes were received, and at only the second attempt, I found what looked like a star map, Lunan said in 1998. Now, to be fair, the signals Hals was picking up turned out to be something known as long-delay echoes. Long-delayed echoes are radio echoes that return to the sender several seconds after a radio transmission has occurred. If you watch football on your TV and on your laptop through the internet, the TV broadcast is actually faster than what you're watching on your laptop, despite you watching a live match. This is an example of echo as the signal or transmission returns several seconds apart. Now, in some cases, the difference is so small that you would hardly notice it, and in some cases, it takes long that you do. The rule of thumb for LDEs is that any delay of longer than 2.7 seconds are considered LDEs. And believe me, it's a whole other story that I don't want to get involved in. But what I was trying to explain was that this was not a fully understood concept back then, and it puzzled a lot of people. Then, in 1954, newspapers like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner reported that the US Air Force had found 2 satellites orbiting the Earth. But the crazy thing was, at that time, no country had the technology to launch them. Black Knight seemed to have been found by more than one source, and the US Air Force confirmed this. And even if the US denied it, there were credible sources from other countries that said otherwise. This was the third time this particular object was referenced in 3 different timelines, one in 1899 by Tesla, another in 1927 by Hals and a group of scientists, another in 1954 by the US Air Force, and a new one in 1998 by NASA. So what was this black object that keeps orbiting for all time? By 1960, both the US and the USSR had spacecrafts in orbit, competing in what was known as the space race. But on February 11, 1960, word spread all over the world that someone else had something in orbit as well. Something had been picked up by a radar screen made by the US Navy to find enemy spy satellites, but instead of spy planes, it found something else. It was reported as a dark, tumbling object. It didn't belong to the Americans or the Soviets. The next day, the media had a little more to say about it. It was orbiting about 79 degrees away from the equator, which is not 90 degrees like a correct polar orbit. It also had a very odd orbit, with an apogee of 1,728 kilometers, and a perigee of only 216 kilometers. For those who don't understand, apogee is the point in the moon's orbit where it is farthest from the Earth, while its closest approach is known as perigee. The object also made a complete orbit every 104.5 minutes. Meanwhile, the US Navy was tracking one known casing from an old Discoverer launch. It was a half shell that was just under 6 meters long. The Discoverer 8 rocket took off on November 20th, 1959, and it was the first step towards sending a person into space and then retrieving him in a parachuting pod. So in other words, this was a dummy test. The launch went as planned, but its mission to eject its 136-kilogram capsule didn't go so well. The capsule itself got lost in orbit, similar to that of the Black Knight, and was later declared lost. The Navy tracked one of the casings, which was orbiting every 103 minutes at 80 degrees, with an apogee of 950 kilometers and a perigee of 187 kilometers, which many of you watching would think was the Black Knight, but it was not. For starters, the strange object had an apogee of 1,728 kilometers and a perigee of only 216 kilometers, while the US Navy had an apogee of 950 kilometers and 187 kilometer perigee. The Navy casing just happened to pass the same street as the Black Knight. This means there were two objects there, one human, the other still a John Doe. In September 1960, after the radar first picked up on the satellite, a tracking camera at Grumman Aircraft Corporation's Long Island factory took a picture of it. By this time, people on the ground had been seeing it for about 2 weeks, and they could make it out as a red glowing object moving from east to west. Most satellites at the time, according to what little information I could find, moved from west to east, but the Black Knight did the reverse. Plus, the speed of the object was 3 times faster than normal. A committee was quickly set up to look into it, but the results of such findings was never made public. And for a while, things were quiet. Then, in 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper said he saw a greenish UFO while he was on his 15th flight on Mercury 9. Now, here's the thing. Not only did Gordon Cooper see it, but about 100 people at NASA's Mutchia tracking station near Perth, Australia, saw it on their radar screens. Later, the government came out to say that Cooper's electronics broke down and that he took in too much carbon dioxide, which made him see and hear things that weren't there. By the way, this was someone who was their go-to guy for space missions. The youngest astronaut to fly, piloted the longest and last Mercury spaceflight, the first American to spend an entire day in space, the first to sleep in space, and the last American launched on an entirely solo orbital mission. If he was crazy, why let him continue flying for you? Despite the government's efforts, the Black Knight's truth seemed impossible to deny or cover up. Now, remember this guy again? Researchers from Scotland, led by Duncan Lunan, wanted to know for sure what Howes heard in 1927. He looked over the LDE data that the Norwegian scientists had given him. After much research, Lunan found that it was a map of the stars that led to Epsilon Bootis, a double star in the Bootis constellation. It was looking like whatever the Black Knight was, it seemed to be sending an invitation from the people of Epsilon Bootis. And according to him and his research, they've been sending this invitation for about 12,600 years. The Epsilon Bootis, by the way, is a double star in the northern constellation of Bootis. It has the traditional name of Izar and Polkerema. The star system can be viewed kind of easily at night, but resolving the pair with a small telescope is challenging. An aperture of 76 millimeters, 3 inches, or greater is required. But as usual, once he released his findings to the public, he was ridiculed and called crazy. But all of that changed as the final piece of proof came in 1998, when the Space Shuttle Endeavour made its first flight to the International Space Station on flight STS-88. Astronauts aboard Endeavour took many photographs of a strange object, which were widely available to the public on the NASA website, and it showed an object that had an eerie resemblance to the Black Knight, which brought back public interest in this object. Certainly, it can't be the same object from 1899 all the way to 1998, but with each passing day and with each deep research conducted by curious minds like you watching this video, it was beginning to look like it was the same object. Now here's the crazy part and what added fuel to the conspiracy. Despite the pictures being made available on the NASA website, the same pictures just disappeared. They reappeared sometime later with new URLs and with different descriptions that said the object captured was all of a sudden. Labeling this object as space junk was a smart move because, to be fair, Earth is surrounded by space junk. We have more than 100,000 pieces of space trash just orbiting Earth as we wait for it to crash land. These junks are made up of broken pieces of rock and equipment that have made their way into our atmosphere and are now stuck in orbit with us. But if it was space junk originally, why delete all the pictures in the first place and re-upload them back? I don't know about you, but that sounds like suspicious behavior to me. And it turns out, this is something NASA does a lot. Quite a few people have come forward to say that NASA regularly changes its photos to remove what I call interesting photobombing, aka UFO sightings, before putting them in the public domain. Back then, all of that editing had to be done by hand. These days, picture editing software like Photoshop does a lot of that for you. And like I said, the fact that those pictures were taken down and re-uploaded with tagline "Space Junks" makes it hard to believe them. Here's something about NASA that a lot of people don't know. The National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, which formed NASA, says that the agency can keep secret information from the public for national security reasons. I can understand the Air Force doing that. I can even understand Instagram doing that to hide trade secrets. But what information does NASA have to keep secret about space for national security reasons? I really don't know. You can help and tell me what you think it is in the comments section. The crazy thing is that people who were alive during the 50s or 60s could testify that no one in the entire world knew what the satellite or object was. That was a fact, no questions about it. Then all of a sudden, anytime you search for the Black Knight, the story somehow gets attached to the 1998 NASA mission, like as if that was ever the first time we saw the object. The propaganda is so good that it has people questioning their reality, saying stuff like, "Did I really see it?" Because it's so crazy how something went from, "What the heck is that?" to, "Oh, that's just a spare part." We all knew it was there, but it was just out of reach, and we had no clue what it actually was or why it was there. The only plausible explanation that was making sense was that this could be of alien origin. Duncan Lunan wrote an article in 1973 for Spaceflight magazine that said people who were studying long-delayed echoes might not have thought about the possibility that the Black Knight came from an alien space probe. At the same time, Lunan said that his study has nothing to do with the Black Knight nonsense, and he is not making any connections between his idea and the Black Knight. But shortly after this, Lunan later admitted that his method wasn't scientific and that he was completely wrong, and he retracted his statement. Now, saying you lied isn't the problem, but the manner in which it was told made people believe Duncan might have retracted his statements due to threats. I don't know how true that is, but I can certainly tell you that NASA has a lot to explain. Like I said, NASA does have a lot to explain. And boy oh boy, they did explain a lot, providing testimonies and proof that all these were just in our heads. When the Discoverer satellites were being launched in 1960, that was the most interesting part of the story. Dudley Sharp, Secretary of the Air Force, told the press that this new unknown object was likely the second case from Discoverer 8. He said it was likely the twin of the known piece they were already following, because it was the right size and in the right place. This was soon proven. The identification was even written about in Time magazine, but it was on the back page, which most people won't see. because a boring explanation is not as interesting as a mystery item. Also, there's a cool side note about the Discoverer program. The CIA was involved with it through a program of their own called Corona. The details of the program were declassified in 1992, and with it showed that the Discoverer rockets weren't really meant to send people into space, but rather to carry Corona spy satellites. Using a polar orbit lets the craft fly all over the Earth's surface, making it possible to photograph, well, everything. This is different from regular semi-equatorial orbits, which can only cover a certain range of latitudes. In those days, there was no way to send digital pictures back to Earth. Instead, film cameras were used, and the film had to be dropped back to Earth to be developed and inspected. The Corona KH-1 camera would come out of orbit and open a parachute. A JC-130 rescue plane would then catch the parachute in the air. So, even the supposed truth the government gave us for Black Knight was a lie and a cover-up for the CIA spy planes. Even though the whole Discoverer program was a lie, the flights and results that were written about in the news at the time were, in fact, true. The only lie was the actual intentions of the Discoverer. As for Gordon Cooper's claims of what he saw from Mercury 9, which all the radio operators agreed with, well, turns out that Cooper himself said that what he saw was nothing. But don't get the wrong idea. Gordon Cooper said he saw a lot of UFOs while he was flying. He remains adamant about a fleet of UFOs that he says flew overhead while he was stationed in Germany. But when it comes to the Mercury 9 story of him seeing aliens, he strongly says it is a complete fabrication by UFO authors and it never happened. He also showed all the transcripts, even the ones he wrote himself, as proof that nothing like that happened during his flight. Now, we are only left with Endeavour's STS-88 mission and its amazing viral pictures. According to NASA, it turns out the mystery object in the famous 1998 picture was nothing more than a thermal blanket that got lost and drifted away. NASA mission STS-88 was the first mission from the United States that started the construction of the International Space Station. Since Russia already had the Zarya module in space, this mission's job was to link it to the American Unity module. The mission's goals were met by the crew, who put up handrails and tested a safety device that would keep passengers from drifting into space if they lost their attachment. But there were some problems along the way. The modules weren't quite lined up right the first time, so when the shuttle's robotic arm let go to try again, a few things floated away, including the thermal blanket covering, which is what the photo's mysterious picture seems to be. They even provided the color of the blanket as silver on one side and black on the other. It was crumpled and formed an odd shape. If you didn't know what to expect, the average person would have no clue what it was. But unfortunately for the story, and luckily for the astronauts, it wasn't an alien spacecraft, but space junk. As for Tesla, it is true that he did indeed pick up radio signals in 1899 from space. But what he picked up is what astronomists call pulsars. They were not known back then, and were officially discovered in 1968. So, during Tesla's time, he thought he was communicating with intelligent messages that couldn't be deciphered, but it was nothing more than a super dense, rapidly moving star corpse. As for the Norwegian scientists, once again, they did receive LDE radio reflections, but no one knows what caused them yet, just like they didn't know back then. We now have 5 likely causes for LDEs. Any or all of them could be to blame for some of them, and they most likely have to do with strange things happening in the Earth's ionosphere. However, if an alien satellite elected to enter our orbit, record our transmissions, and transmit them back to us 8 seconds later, it could well have the same effect. There are about 15 possible reasons for LDE, and none of these include alien satellites in orbit around Earth. But let's just say for argument's sake, we don't understand yet because our tech hasn't evolved to that point yet, just like with Tesla. And as for the name Black Knight, it turns out the name is quite popular. Here's what I mean. The name Black Knight is a common name that has been assigned to several real projects.
0 hour at Woomera, South Australia. Black Knight, Britain's first space rocket, had its cables released and was all set for the takeoff. The Australian Ministry of Supply cooperated with the mother country.
For example, between 1958 and 1965, the UK fired 22 rockets as part of a program called Black Knight. The goal was to test different types of re-entry vehicles, but Black Knight never put anything into orbit. In fact, its second stage fired as it was coming back down, not as it was going up, to better stress the re-entry vehicle. So the Black Knight satellite could have gotten its theories from several Black Knight projects that are not even related to each other. And that's the problem I have with stories like these, the multitude of cover-ups and lies. So, when you put all these together, it starts to make sense. Maybe it was just a thermal blanket. There's nothing up there, or we're just overthinking things. And you might be right, but I have one question. How could the object be the discoverer when neither the Soviets nor the US had the tech to send spacecraft into polar orbit? It wasn't until the 1960s that the Black Knight satellite was found again in polar orbit. Experts in astronomy and science say the object weighed more than 10 tons, making it the heaviest man-made satellite ever to orbit Earth at the time, which, at that time, we as a human race didn't have the technology to do. And as for NASA's claim of the object being a thermal blanket, this part of the story is not right in many ways. To begin, both the shuttle and the International Space Station always flew in a semi-equatorial orbit, so that means an object passing in a polar orbit would have gone by at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, which is far too fast to be visible, and certainly far too fast for so many high-quality photos to be taken. I'm not saying NASA lied, but I'm just simply stating the truth, because when you put all these together, it is certainly looking like 1 + 1 isn't 2 anymore. But hey, what do I know? I'm only a YouTube channel. Maybe someone in the comments will have a better answer. So, I ask again, what was it?